Hello and welcome to Postcards from Antioch. We're really glad that you're joining us today. I'm Oz, your host today, and Nicole's with us, who's going to be speaking all about abundance and scarcity in a short series we're doing on social justice. Hi Nicole, how are you doing?
Hello, yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you doing? You're looking very brown.
I'm really enjoying the summer. And yes, I'm very well. So I thought we're talking a bit about food, etc. What have you got lined up for lunch? I'd love to know.
I'm really naughty. Every time I come down to Canterbury or Faversham, I stop back at Burger King or McDonald's on the way home. So I've got a Burger King, I think, lined up today. Uh,
Well,
yeah,
that
I'm
helps
quite
you
excited.
push through with the teaching and then enjoy the reward,
Yeah,
the promised land
exactly.
to come of McDonald's or
See,
Burger
it's the
King.
only reason I come down, to be honest, is because I know that I've got that burger on the way home.
Yeah, well, I just had a cheeky fried egg sandwich, so I think I've splashed out a bit as well today. Good. Well, so this is all about growing in understanding the Bible, theology, leadership training, and so yeah, this topic. Shall we dive in and have a look at what we're going to cover? How are we going to do this today?
Yeah, so this is as you said, Oz, this is the second. I'm not sure what order actually we're gonna put them in. But I'm looking at two different ways of thinking about social justice. And so the one we're looking at today is abundance and scarcity, and these two different mindsets that we kind of see again and again in the Bible. So it's going to be, I think, quite a Bible-based session. So I'm glad to see that you've got yours out ready.
It's ready.
And we'll do a little test, see how quickly you can get to the verses. But we are going to be looking at it through the lens of food. And for those of you who know me will perhaps know that it's a particular interest of mine, food in the Bible. But actually, food is a really great way of looking at this because I mean, everyone needs to eat. Like it's a fundamental human thing, and yet it can easily be distorted. And we're going to be thinking a little bit about consumerism and how actually we can distort the way that we see food. But because consumerism, it applies to lots of different things: food, clothing, housing, abundance and scarcity. It's got huge implications. But we're gonna look, I guess, with the lens of food, through the
Sure.
lens of food.
So yeah, am I right in saying your PhD into this area is going to help you justify your ability to head up the M2 and grab a Burger King on the way home? Is that
Well,
the
it's
kind of
really
hope?
not. The more I read about it, the more I think, oh my gosh, that's not the right way. That's not sustainable. It's consumerism. It's bad for you. Genuinely, I am, feel very challenged by what I
Hopefully,
read.
we won't all feel guilty at the end of this for the little
Yeah, I
indulgence.
really hope not.
Yet at the same time, we'll see a bit more about God's plan for us to enjoy food, celebrate,
Yeah,
and yet
exactly.
also keep in mind the real challenges. Okay,
Mm.
good. That's going to be great, and we're going to dive in and out of different
Mm,
passages of
hmm
the
hmm
Bible. So, where do we start on a topic like this? What right in Genesis, I guess.
Yeah,
Uh,
you nailed it. I mean, I feel like if we counted the number of times we start our podcast in Genesis, it would be like, I don't know, 75% or something, but we are going to start in Genesis. So if you don't mind opening your Bible to Genesis 1, we're going right to the beginning. And can you read verses 27 to 30 for me? So this is after God has created everything and he creates mankind. And then we get this.
So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. The purpose is to look after creation, to be stewards, to take care of it. And we see this, don't we? That man plays a part in creation. We see in Genesis 2, verses 5 to 9 and 15 to 17, that he plays a part in creating, in not in creating, I beg your pardon, in naming creation. He's made from the dirt himself, and actually there's like the link to his name, dirt, earth, in Hebrew. This is again when my pronunciation absolutely fails me, but it's like Adamaha, or something similar. So the name Adam means dirt. There's this real link between humanity and looking after the earth. And of course,
Yeah.
God says, doesn't he? You can eat from all of.
Yeah, all of the seed-bearing
Yep.
plant on the
Hmm.
face of the
Hmm.
whole earth, every tree that has fruit with seed in it, that'll be yours for food. So God's
Mm.
pretty clear about this.
Yeah.
Go eat. This is for you.
Mm.
This is good food. Um, I'll be given, a bit of a menu.
Yeah.
The garden is yours to eat. Wow.
Yeah.
Every green plant for food.
Mm.
And it was so.
Yeah. And it's a bit of a leading question. Very simple. But does that sound like an easy or hard way of getting food to you, Oz?
Well, to me, it sounds okay. Literally reach up, grab, enjoy the orchard, enjoy the berries, the bushes. I quite like my fruits and
You do.
vegetables.
I
So
did before this podcast. Oz said he'd go and get some snacks, and he did offer us fruit, and then he saw my face, I think, fall, and then therefore brought sweets and crisps,
I
which
did
is
indeed. Yeah, very much. Yeah, chocolate, sweets, crisps.
yeah,
That's a kind of a good snack, actually.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
not found here,
But
though.
that is not found here. We see fruit, but as you said, yeah, it's easy. It's just reach out and grab it. And so we have this picture of the Garden of Eden as abundance, abundance that is shared and enjoyed, and yet there's an element of responsibility, of looking after, of naming, um, that goes along with that. And Oz, easy question for you. Do you know when that changes? Like when does this fall apart?
Well, it falls apart in Genesis 3 when we
With
find
the
that
fall.
the fall happens,
But a bunch.
and
Yeah.
the one tree that Adam and Eve were instructed not to take of the fruit, they end up doing in curiosity, but really
Yeah.
rebellious defiance.
Mm.
And yeah, then the circumstances change.
Mm.
So I guess with that comes a different relationship that we have with food. Is that where we're going? How does
Yeah,
that get impacted by the fall?
yeah, that's kind of what I'm angling for, actually. So again, if you don't mind reading Genesis 3, and we're looking at verses 17 to 19.
Which say, to Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you'll eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you'll eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you'll eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you'll return. Do you know, I've not really I've read these verses quite a lot, but just looking out for that word food, it comes up a lot.
Oh my God. Like once you look for it, I mean, I get mocked by, James and Ross in particular for looking at food in the Bible. But genuinely, once you start looking for it, it is everywhere, and God like clearly cares about it so much. But there's a couple of really interesting things about our relationship with food that come from this passage. So Oz, do you want to have a guess where I'm going with this?
Yeah, so it won't be easy. Grab, enjoy. Suddenly we've got the ground that is cursed.
And this is really, really fascinating because it's the only, like, the other time that God curses or pronounces the consequences of the sin, depending on which way you're going to look at it. The first time when he says it to the serpent, it's the serpent that has the ramifications that is cursed, and I think that actually uses the word curse. With the woman, the consequences of that sin is on her, like in terms of it's about her, the way she bears children. And with this one, he cursed is the ground. Like our human actions have a massive consequence, not just on us, but on creation, which is mind blowing. I actually think that's
definitely
that responsibility.
And the consequence of that is hard work, is toil, is the sweat of your brow, is the not just the heat of the day, but actually having to work in the heat of the day in order to reap the benefits of the hard work of toiling the land and all the rest. So yeah, wow. Impact of thorns, thistles, there's challenge. Eating and food becomes no longer straightforward, abundant blessing, but wrapped up in the curse, consequence of sin.
And I think this, you can use, I think, this to apply to a lot of different aspects of our relationship with food. So I mean, you can take the I guess the straight line. Well, that means obviously, as you said, we're gonna have to work for our food. Like there's going to be labor involved. But I think also it does talk about our food relationship with food in general. Whereas before, I think, it's a straightforward, uncomplicated relationship with food. Now we see there's tension. So perhaps actually you could also argue this is where some of our unhealthy food habits began. Like, I mean, I'm thinking about,
Yeah. Well, if there's a deep dependence on food,
yeah,
which is hard to get, then you
yeah,
grab it, and greed might be an outworking, I
yeah,
guess,
yeah,
because you're like,
agreed.
well, this is
Hmm.
mine. I've worked hard for this.
Yeah.
Maybe that's going to impact my
Mm.
ability to share.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
definitely. And so that's what we begin to see. And actually throughout I would say the entirety of the Old Testament, you do have this idea of God's blessing being about providing food. I mean, you think back to the promises like Abraham and um, when that's reiterated to Moses about this promised land full of milk and honey, and that's what makes it great, is the milk and the honey. Like it's this idea of having a land that is um not only will sustain you and nourish you, but like, it's milk and honey. It's
Yeah.
good. It's like maybe luxurious might be slightly too far, but it's
Yeah.
more than just eating to survive. This is
That's
about,
right. There's an enjoyment, a
yeah.
pleasure, a delight in eating honey, and yeah, the different things like that. And then I think I was reading recently something about the oil of the
Mm,
land also
mm-hmm,
being a
mm-hmm,
benefit. And think
mm,
of olive oil, so olives
mm-hmm,
and grapes and wine. Those things take time. And so
mm,
that suggests being in the land for a period of peace in order
yeah,
to cultivate the riches of the land
yeah,
and enjoy them, for which goes with the blessing of
mm,
land as well. So
completely.
food is used quite a lot through, you're saying, through the story of the people of Israel
Yeah,
as a
and
part of the promise.
yes, exactly. And so an Old Testament theologian called Walter Brueggemann has written a fantastic article about this idea of abundance versus scarcity mindset, and it's where I've got a lot of it's heavily influenced these ideas that I'm saying today. And he talks about this, but he does it through the lens of looking at Pharaoh and Israel. So as you're saying, like that story of Israel, and he talks about Pharaoh being this picture of anxiety, of hoarding. And what was really interesting, so if you we're still in Genesis, if you jump to Genesis 47 for me, um, and this is actually back when Joseph is involved. So we have this dream that Pharaoh has of a famine that's coming, that Joseph correctly interprets, and Joseph says, "But don't worry, this is what we're going to do." And he advises that a fifth of all produce is to belong to Pharaoh, and that they're to create these massive storehouses. Um, and by verse 20 and 21, if you don't mind just reading those two for me.
Sure. It says, so Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. Shall
Yeah.
I carry on?
Actually, that's fine. What becomes really interesting is what starts out as this very helpful idea that Joseph has of, collecting food, creating basically a food bank, a government-run food bank, actually takes on this, depending on how you read it, but it could be read as slightly sinister, like all of the land is taken off. The Egyptians, like Pharaoh, has control. Like his anxiety is driving this policy of land accumulation, and he is then in control of who gets what food. And what we see is this same anxiety coming out when it comes to the Israelites, because the Israelites turn up wanting, well, Joseph's brothers
Yeah.
turn out wanting some food. They're given the food, but then they move to Egypt, and their numbers, well, grow and
Yeah.
grow and
Yeah.
grow until Pharaoh, a different Pharaoh, but still the title Pharaoh, gets anxious and worried about not, them overtaking, and
Yeah.
therefore forces them into
Yeah, that sort of
slavery.
servitude. Yeah. So there's quite a power dynamic as well, isn't there? For those that have the control of the food over those that don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts others in a position of weakness or need
Yeah.
or oppression, you might say.
Yeah, 100%. And this is why, if you have listened to the podcast that I did on liberation theology, this is where you might be thinking, oh, I've heard some of that. It's ringing a bell. And this isn't necessarily a particular liberation theology way of reading it, but there are links to that. So if you haven't listened to that, go and listen to it. So yeah, we have this people that are, forced into slavery and are forced to rely on the Pharaoh for all of their food. We're led to assume that they don't get fed a huge amount. They're slaves. It's all about building up the Egyptians' economy through making bricks, and and of course God is not happy with that. God liberates them and sets them free. And so I was going to say, like, what I wonder if what happens. What are some of the key things that happen when the Israelites are led out of Egypt from Moses? What are some of the events that take place after that?
So they get across to Mount Sinai after
Mm-hmm.
the various miracles and crossing of the Red Sea.
Yep.
And then they move into this kind of temporary wilderness period for 40 years due to their rebellious sin and inability to take the land of Canaan because of doubting the fact that God would be with them. And so, but part of that time in the wilderness involved needing food. And in the wilderness, there isn't a lot. So that there was a fear, a concern, a question over how that would be managed. And God said that he would provide. He would feed them. He would sustain them so their sandals wouldn't wear out and all these kind of things. You think, oh, wow. So, and he does that through promising them manna, which is this wafer-like, honey-tasting, wafer-like bread in the morning, and providing a flock of quails in the evening. So you get bread in the morning and meat in the evening, and there's a number of instructions linked to that. It's about moderation, I think, but kind of how about just taking the right amount for the day rather than doubling up. Don't fill your cupboards up to but basically, and so they are warned that if they don't obey that, then maggots will grow in the manna and lead to issues and spoil the lot. And so that's the challenge. Then on the sixth day, they have to collect double the amount, so they're set for the Sabbath and can indeed rest. So there's this then pattern that's established, a relationship with food that God provides and keeps them trusting, and that's found in Exodus.
Yeah, that's Exodus 16, and that is so it's such a crucial moment, I think, for the Israelites. And actually, I think from what I can remember, it comes actually before they reach Sinai. Right. It's really early on, and it's so crucial, and it's really interesting because these are a people that have been forced to rely on Pharaoh. They've been forced to see their identity as workers, and so we get this real teaching moment from God that he will provide. He's in charge of the food, like the provision of food. You nailed it when you said that there's that mandate not to hoard, which again is what we saw with Pharaoh. He took and he took and he took. And actually we see God saying, no, you do not need to hoard out of anxiety. You can trust that I will keep providing. And equally, on the seventh day it's good to rest, and therefore you do not need to again go after food with anxiety, thinking, oh, there's not going to be enough, because actually you don't need to be constantly working. You can trust and rest in that provision.
So food's linked directly to our relationship with God, our ability to trust him,
100%,
to rely on him to be the provider, rather than just about the function of food to nourish our bodies so that we can walk and do the jobs we need to. Wow.
100%.
So there's a spiritual significance with our relationship with food.
Definitely.
And didn't the people of Israel through the wilderness years groan and mumble and complain?
Yeah.
Can't we go back to Egypt and enjoy our cucumbers or something?
No,
it's like bizarre. I'm sure cucumbers are referred to.
Cucumbers are referred to. I'm not sure. That's not the verse that I'm particularly thinking of. But maybe it is cucumber, but they definitely talk about the meat. They talk about, we just sat around and ate meat, which is a very rose-tinted view of slavery. But yes, there's this element of not being grateful.
And they had a different memory of their kind of eating habits, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And yet God, I think he does rebuke them for that, and he does again teach them again and again to trust in his provision. I wondered, I think there's a really, if we're thinking about social
Mm.
justice, I think there's a really glaring problem with this when I say it as we've said it, and I wonder whether that was ringing any alarm bells with you, but it just sounds very naive and romantic, doesn't it? Just trust in God. God will provide.
That's it.
And you know, if God wants to bless you, he'll give you food and land. And obviously, you know, food poverty is a huge problem.
It is. So this isn't a promise for all people for all time.
Mm.
This is a unique moment in the story of Israel and God's plan for a people.
Yeah.
So I suppose, we shouldn't wake up expecting manna on our lawn. Um, but the principles of how we trust God to provide, I guess, continue. But
Mm.
yes, but there are many people around the world that don't eat food
Mm.
twice a day, once a day. And so that does force the question, doesn't it? What's our role as Christians and as churches to
Mm.
engage in that issue?
And I think it has a particular emphasis in our Western civilization, because the reason people go hungry in this country is not because we don't have the food, it's they don't have access to food through normally for financial reasons, and that sheds, I think, a slightly different view on it, like as a focus on it, than say third world countries where it's famine necessarily
Yeah.
that's causing it. But this is when we come back partly to Genesis and this idea of stewardship, and actually as part of being good stewards is ensuring that the abundance that God has given creation is accessible for all people.
Yeah.
And that's something that we see throughout the whole Bible actually, and the the laws in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, often focus on ensuring that those who are on the outskirts of society, the widow, the orphan, those who fall outside of the the social safety net, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, the orphan, the widow didn't have that patriarch, didn't have that male figure who was supposed to be able to work and provide,
Yeah.
and therefore they are more likely to be poor or hungry. And so there are laws that focus on the foreigner as well, the sojourner, that ensure that they've got food, like being able to go and collect the wheat that's fallen on the
Yeah.
floor. You know, you've got feasts that are where they're invited to you and they're shared with them. I mean, there's many, there's loads and loads, but you see within that God is saying, okay, it's not just enough to trust in me,
Yeah.
but actually we need to be promoting this idea of abundance and ensuring that all can access
Yes.
the abundance.
So an importance to continue to steward our resources well,
Yeah, exactly.
and think of those that do not have or have less and are challenged and on the edge of that need an extra safety net beyond what maybe many do. Yeah. Okay. So that's a sort of indirect application through some of the Old Testament. Is there much else as we work through that, or that as we
Yeah,
look towards Christ as well in the New Testament?
definitely. And I mean, I've just picked out a few examples. I mean, you could just keep going in the Old
Yeah.
Testament, to be honest, as the prophets and I mean the Psalms. Honestly, it crops up again and again. Once you start looking
Yeah.
for it, it's everywhere. But I think you're right to point us to the New Testament, because with Jesus we see his proclamation of the kingdom of heaven is here, and we see him embody this idea of eating with abundance and eating and sharing and enjoying in God's provision. Again, I completely put you on the spot here, haven't prepped you at all. Can you think of any examples where Jesus is promoting abundance in eating, or promoting that abundance mindset?
Yeah. Well, one would be the wedding at Cana. It's more the wine than the food,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
providing something that was in lack and of great quality, and to reflect the occasion and joy and celebration, but also point to who he was. And that was actually described as manifesting his glory. So it's more than just, we've got a problem, I'll step in because I'm the Son of God. Provision of feeding of the 5,000.
Yes.
And that points back to
It
maybe
does.
a little bit of what we've talked about.
100%. So actually, there's a lot of thought in biblical scholarship that when Jesus is doing is giving the bread, doing the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. That is a direct link back to God providing for his people in the desert, because that's the thing, like these people are who've come to listen to Jesus are kind of away from civilization. They've come out to listen to him, and Jesus provides this abundance out of basically nothing, in the same way that God provided that abundance. And so yes, it's thought that Jesus is symbolizing, like we are supposed to read that Jesus is symbolizing that he is God feeding his people.
And in John, is that where he says, "I am the bread of life"? So
oh my gosh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Feed on me, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many. And the other one that I think is particularly poignant is in Matthew, and I actually haven't written it down, but the when he talks about, why do you worry about what you will eat? Why do you worry about what you will wear? Because, if God provides for the sparrow and God, clothes the lilies, then of course he's going to provide for you. And so we see this idea of, we don't need to be scared. Like, we don't need to be hoarding and stressed about food. We can trust in God's abundance. But on the flip side, those of us with access to the abundance need to be making sure that everyone can access the abundance,
giving to those in need and the poor, and those without, and hospitality for not just those you might anticipate, but those on the edge of the society as well.
Completely.
So okay, so Jesus is modeling a bit of a reversal from the fall, and beginning to fulfill much of what the Old Testament law was saying about care for those that were in need, and take it on a new level through what he was proclaiming. Amazing. And so, are there any other significant references by Jesus or in the New Testament that help us on this subject?
I mean, I think the one we didn't mention, which is a really obvious one, is in Matthew 25, when he talks about the parable of the sheep and the goats. Can you be able to give a short summary of that?
So Jesus says essentially that they'll separate the sheep and the goats, but those that are like the sheep will be those that know his voice and will clothe the sick, visit the prisoner, feed the hungry. And if you do to such, you do to me. And if you don't, then you're essentially turning your back to Jesus, not just those that are poor and in need. And such will be the case in the end. So the way that we relate to those in need, the way that we feed, care, step in and act with social justice, is a reflection of our relationship to Jesus.
Exactly. And I think they're really, because the Trust or Trust, the big food bank charity run by Christians, or not run, but started by Christians, specifically looked at this verse in Matthew 25 about feeding the hungry in the name of Jesus. So it's well known, but the thing that we often forget is the bit after. It's if you feed the hungry, if you show hospitality, and that's sometimes the bit that we get a little bit separated from, because what we see in the New Testament is this idea of Jesus sharing this abundance, of not being anxious, but he's sharing it in the sense of, it's not always the feeding of the 5,000 where he's giving it. Like he eats with his disciples. He eats with such a varied community of people. I mean,
Zacchaeus, he says, "Look, I'm going to come to your house," and then he ends up hosting Jesus. And today's salvation has come to this house.
Exactly. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was on the outskirts of that Jewish society. He was hated, really. And
the Pharisees were quick to recognize this practice by Jesus, weren't they? And kind of point the finger and go, "You're eating with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes. And how can you be, you're not clean."
Yeah, well, 100%. And at this point, it kind of dates back to the laws in the Torah, but particularly in this idea of the Second Temple Judaism. So around the time of Jesus, you have these really, really strict eating laws that the Jews had to follow, where they weren't allowed to eat with people who were unclean. So basically anyone, who had sinned or had certain diseases, or to be honest, even having women at the table was often frowned upon. Um, Certainly a tax collector would be someone who you wouldn't be allowed to eat with. And what we see is Jesus say, actually, like, those laws are not right when they're that divisive. And he just came and he really broke the social customs, and ate with everyone. And in doing so, presents this picture of that community sharing in abundance. And we see that, we continue to see that in the early church, in Acts.
Yeah.
Think of Peter when he has that vision. God saying, he has the vision of the unclean foods coming down, and God saying, "Go, kill and eat," and saying, "Actually, I don't want you to stick to those food laws where they're causing problems, where you're not able to go and evangelize to the Gentiles. Don't stick to them at that point. Share in this abundance together." And there's a real mission, like a evangelistic element to this shared community.
Yeah, and I think for the Jews that was pretty hard hitting. It's not
Oh
what
my
goes
gosh,
into
yeah.
your body that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of the heart that makes you unclean. And suddenly to be told, the laws matter, but not at the expense of the Gentiles coming into the family of God. Yeah. And we haven't even mentioned the Last Supper and the sacrament of communion, the Lord's Supper. So there's a huge significance of the meal there as well. And the Bible finishes with a big meal, doesn't it?
It starts and it finishes with food, which is what I love. It finishes with the wedding banquet. And again, that all people, all nations, all tongues, enjoying God's provision. And I think that's really interesting. And we've kind of looked at the Bible, but I just want us to sort of now draw towards, well, what does that mean for us then? Like, how do we live with this abundance mindset that God will provide for us, but as part of that, we have responsibility to ensure that all are provided for.
Yeah, because it's easy for us to say that maybe in our circumstances with employment and privilege of families and support or whatever, but many don't. So what are those practical applications for how we take this theological principle and live it out? What have you got in mind?
Well, I think to be honest, I'm still working through what does that look like. And I think one of the great things is when you look at how Christians are responding to the problem of food poverty. And again, I'm taking food as an example, but actually we can apply this to clothing, housing, money. There's a whole load that we can.
Did you hear about the warm banks on the news last week?
No, I didn't actually.
There's food banks this winter. It won't be the talk of food banks. It'll be heating banks or warm banks because of the fuel crisis in terms of heating, gas, electricity, etc., and the cost. So you're right. Yeah. It's not just food, but.
So yes, that's a perfect example. There are so many different ways that I think Christians are responding, from food banks to communal meals, to food pantries, which are slightly different. So that's a membership-based venture where people pay maybe like a $5 and get to take 20, better value products, if that makes sense. So they're getting a lot more than is worth for a $5, but at the same time they're still I guess it's giving them more agency. They get more choice. I'm just trying to think what else. I mean, there's social campaigning. There's a whole bunch of things we can do.
And you're suggesting as Christians we should be involved in those things. Observe the government trying to provide and local charities and councils stepping in. We have a responsibility.
I didn't actually specifically say that, but yes, I think that's exactly what this drives at, is that actually we have a responsibility to think about this and perhaps to challenge the way that we consume as well, because I mean, this is a bit of an extreme example, but you think back to the beginning of the pandemic and the toilet roll hoarding. And actually, there is something in us that wants to hoard. We do get anxious, and we do, think, what if there's not enough? And so I think perhaps as Christians, we should be challenged by that. And yeah, perhaps think, okay, well, if I'm enjoying this abundance, how can others? Yeah, so I do think we have a responsibility. And perhaps I think this other thing, if we go back to that idea of God providing and all our food coming from God, are we honestly thinking about food in that way? Like, do we honestly see each meal as God's provision? I mean, I think this is why grace is a brilliant
Yeah.
thing, the idea of praying before a meal. Um,
Yeah, and
yeah.
certain festivals in the past might have helped us mark that more, like harvests
Yeah,
and
that's true.
Thanksgiving. But we live less in an agricultural mindset now, because you can get strawberries any time of
100%.
year.
Yeah.
You're not, and certainly if you're in a town and city less than a rural location, that would be the case. So, and we haven't even begun to really step into the whole area of the environment
I know.
and sustainability.
I was thinking that. I mean, it's a huge thing. Like, I'm not gonna. We could, yeah, I could talk for hours about it, but it's worth reflecting and doing a little bit of research on how actually our eating practices in the Western world are unfortunately exploiting the creation and people in the third world. And there is so much, if you start looking into this, so much injustice in the way that we eat. And so I think perhaps this is, yeah, we could go on and on and on. I mean, there's just so much to think about.
Yes.
So this is a good place to start, just to think about, okay, well, how are we honoring God in the way that we honestly thinking about that kind of idea of abundance
and we're not saying we can't enjoy a trip to Burger King, a restaurant celebration for a family occasion, to enjoy because actually that's central to God's kingdom coming. And yet let's not just do that. Let's also be mindful of those that can't engage in those opportunities and practice hospitality in its true nature.
Yes. And I think that's absolutely key, because yeah, as I said, Jesus did all of this in relationship, building relationship with people. We don't see, okay, didn't necessarily exist in this time, but we don't see Jesus giving to a food bank where he has absolutely no idea who's going to receive it. And I'm not criticizing food banks. Like, I'm not saying that they're not needed. But actually, if we're looking just at Jesus's example, we see someone who's building relationships with the poor and the marginalized by eating, and he's filling a physical need, but also there's a relational aspect to it as well.
Right at the start of the church in Acts 6, we see the widows needs being met because they were being overlooked, and food needed to be organized, and that was a church-driven venture, a part of what it means to be real community. So, okay, well, you've given us lots to think about. Biblically, a great kind of sweeping survey, and different aspects of our relationship with food, and also thinking about what real hospitality is about, in abundance, but also that scarcity, the issues, the poverty, and stepping in begins with understanding more, doesn't it?
So exactly.
Anything else you wanted to finish with, or
no?
Does that tie us together nicely?
I think that ties us together nicely. I mean, there's just so much more I could say, but
well, thank you, Nicole. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about food, and I don't know what time of day you're watching this or listening to this, but maybe you want to head off and enjoy a nice lunch or meal, or do that with somebody else that might be in need as well. So there's a great kind of episode we've just had. Thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing with us. Thank you for listening to Postcards from Antioch. We look forward to you joining us again soon, and have a great rest of the day.